the size of the water companies and the scale of Meta or Google is completely incomparable. So I can see where I have leverage over water companies if I collectively organize with my comrades. And as you say, direct a payment strike at just the right time in a way which is guided by knowledge of its financial activities. Google, Samsung, Microsoft, Meta, Amazon.
They're all very vulnerable. They're paper tigers. Let me give you an example of a practical thing that some of us, some years ago, we created something called the Progressive International. We have 200 million of affiliated members around the world, from Brazil all the way to Seattle. And every Black Friday, you know, this awful consumerist apotheosis in December, right? Every Black Friday for the last 3 years, we've organized, you may have seen it, hashtag Make Amazon Pay. This is the Progressive International behind it. And what it is this attempt to combine techno-rebellion with traditional means of supporting trade unionists. So every Black Friday, we have a rolling strike that begins in Vietnam, because this is where the sun rises, in the east. And then so this is a strike in Amazon warehouses in Vietnam, then it goes to Bangladesh, then it goes to India, then it goes to Germany, then it goes to Staten Island, where Chris Small started the first trade union against Amazon, and then it finishes off in Seattle. Now, if we are, and this has been quite successful. Amazon took notice of this, because this is international strike action. But at the same time, what we need to do is we need to convince people on that day not to visit Amazon.com. That would really seriously affect the share price of Amazon on that day. And if you can do this, imagine if we were successful and every week we targeted a multinational company, one of these cloudalists, together with campaigns to bring back to public ownership our electricity grids, our NHS, our water boards, that kind of local and international action which uses tech capital or cloud capital and combines it with traditional and electoral politics is the only way of taking back control of the artifacts that we helped create, because we are producing cloud capital on behalf of cloudalists. So the question is, do we want to let them use it in order effectively to usurp every power and every authority that we may have, or do we want to reclaim these apps and make them, use them in order, for instance, to replace Uber with cooperatives of taxi drivers that use algos, that use their own cooperatively owned and self-managed cloud capital for the purposes of enhancing the experience of being a taxi driver, of using a taxi, of not going into an Uber and thinking, my goodness, I am part of the problem, not the solution.
I'm going to pause you there. I'm going to take 3 questions. We've already run over time, but no one's going to stop me.
I believe I need to use these.
Right, let's go for, all right, I've got my friend in the back with a dark top there. I'm going to take someone from the middle. All right, I've got my friend in the blue shirt right there. And let's take someone from over there, plaid shirt. So dark top at the back, blue shirt in the middle, plaid shirt there.
So we'll take them all together?
All together,
yeah.
And you just
so
go for it.
So I better make notes.
Okay, thank you very much. We've talked at length about the digitization of the world and of American hegemony being challenged by Chinese big tech, especially WeChat. Mm-hmm. With that in mind, what is your take on Ripple, on the XRP ledger, and on the American SEC's decision that XRP is not a security? Do you think that XRP is the horse that the American state is betting on for this new techno-feudal age?
Right, so that's question 1. Are you able to remember that in your head?
Yeah, I'm writing it.
Great, in the middle, blue shirt.
Just stand up or just, yeah? Good.
Stand up so I can see you. Yes,
Yanis.
Hi.
Yanis, thank you for fighting and providing us with a theoretical toolkit to fight the neoliberalism that runs rampant in our institutions. Yanis, on that note, I wanted to ask you about Argentina and Milei, and I'm aware of Argentina's history of Peronism and bloated public spending. And I just wanted to ask you, I presume you're not a fan of his neoliberal shock therapy, but if not that, how would you actually deal with the history of unproductive government spending?
All right, so a little bit of neoliberal shock therapy as a treat. And we've got plaid shirt just over there. Right there.
Thank you for your presentation and for writing your book. So I have a question about regards with the capitalism, who is not anymore capitalism. So for instance, in the 16th and 17th century, we have the book printers, and only very rich people could print books. So that was a form of monopoly. Also, you mentioned cars at the Henry Ford, that Henry Ford actually monopolized the market. So how is that different with cloud providers? Because they monopolized their farms of servers. So they are able to serve an online bookshop for 500 million people. So for instance, if Uber is using AWS, Amazon, right? And AWS gets cheaper, that means that Uber will get competitors. So it is good to have AWS cheaper. It's not a bad thing. So I don't think that's feudalism.
Great. Take it away, Yanis.
Oh, right. Okay. Do I think that the XRP is what the United States government is using? They're trying to use it. They're trying to use it. But I personally don't think that the United States government has a plan on how to deal with the challenge from China, except to shut it down and to create barriers that will prevent the continuing recycling of Chinese profits into Wall Street and into big tech. On Milei. Look, the guy is clearly a fascist. He presents himself as an anarcho-capitalist, but that is impossible. There's no such thing as an anarcho-capitalism or libertarian capitalism. This is a total contradiction in terms. The moment you take the state out of capitalism, capitalism collapses in a heap. The myth that you've got, the market, that operates very well, and that all wealth is produced privately, and then the bad state comes along and collectivizes it through the tax system. That is absolute rubbish. Think of the way that capitalism emerged in this country. How did it emerge in this country? It emerged, and why didn't it emerge in France or in Germany? Because of the central power of the English state, which was much greater than the central power of the French state. Without the power of the state and without the brute force of the English army and the King's army, the feudal lords would never be able to convert themselves into capitalists during the enclosures. Going back to Milei. He's doing nothing more than applying with a very different aesthetic the shock therapy of the IMF. Exactly what the IMF did in Africa, in Asia, in Greece in 2010. They come in, they slash the public sector, essentially making sure that the state continues to provide whatever money is necessary and whatever force and brute force is necessary to keep the feudal lords in Argentina, the large landowners, and the bankers and the rentiers in power, and essentially cut off any support from the working class. Now, the fact that the Peronist system was corrupt, and the fact that it had created levels of inflation that essentially undermined the electoral process, the political process, the center did not hold. Well, you see this in France today. The application of socialism for the very few, corruption and brutal authority and austerity for the many, always shifts power towards, the person who says, I'll make our country great again, give me the power to slash and burn, I will destroy the foundation of corruption by essentially cutting off the needy from any kind of capacity, state capacity, to reproduce themselves. That's Milei. He's going to get his comeuppance, as I said, because these experiments, wherever they've been tried, the way he's trying them. You know, compare and contrast with Pinochet, the brutal, murderous dictator of Chile, who killed Allende and essentially ended any opportunity that Chile had towards becoming a social democracy, a functioning democracy. Pinochet, with the Chicago boys, were much smarter than Milei, because they killed people, they imprisoned people, they liberated finance, they created austerity galore, but at the same time, using the brutal force of the state, they kept minimum wages and minimum pensions at a certain level to maintain a kind of consensus amongst the 40% of the population that supported. Milei is not going to do that. It is clear to me that this is not going to end well for him. We'll see, we'll see. But at the moment, you can see that in the interests of anarchism and liberalism, the Argentinian police is being militarized and attacking the people of Argentina in ways that resemble Gaza, in the center of Buenos Aires. Now, regarding the 16th, look, I don't agree with your take. The fact that the technology of printing in the 16th and 17th century was expensive didn't mean that there was a monopoly. It just meant that it was expensive and only the rich could afford it. You asked me about Henry Ford making cars cheaper. Well, of course, it's, you know, if you need a car and somebody makes cars cheaper, that's of course a good thing. But if you really want to understand the Gilded Age, the Roaring Twenties, the way that this exponential growth of the 1920s on the back of practices like that of Henry Ford brought on the massive collapse of capitalism in 1929. It was the bursting of the bubble that was inflated as a result of the massive optimism created by people like Henry Ford. And then you have 1929, and you have the grapes of wrath, then you have huge discontent, and then you have the New Deal, and then you have the war. This is all part, you know, it's one dynamic, it's the one thing. Now, you talked about, again, in the same way that if you want a car, it's good that somebody like Henry Ford makes it cheaper. If you want digital services, it's good that AWS makes access to service cheaper. But will Uber have a competitor because AWS's services are lower? Absolutely not. Because what Uber has done is already created an empire. And even if you and I were to create a better app for taxis, it is impossible for us to compete with Uber because Uber have created these network effects that we cannot go against. It's like Twitter. Twitter sucks, especially after Elon Musk. I still use it. There is Blue Sky. It's much better, far more, you know, civil than Twitter. But you know, on Twitter I have 1.2 million followers. On Blue Sky I have 350, not million, 350 end, right? And the switching costs are huge. Now you could impose upon the cloudalists similar regulations as we imposed upon the telecom companies. Remember, once upon a time, the older ones you will remember, that if you got a mobile phone, you couldn't keep your number if you switched providers. And that way, they captured you. And then it was simply an act of parliament that forced them to allow you to take your, you know, from Vodafone to another company, to BT or whatever, your number. Maybe we could impose this on Twitter so that we can take all our followers with us. But that's not easy to do. It is not easy to do. Technically, it's not easy to do. And complexity, like in the financial world, is part and parcel of creating power for the cloudalists. So no, it will simply increase the profits of Uber, the rents of Uber, if the digital services of AWS become cheaper.
Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. I do want to take a really quick audience poll, though. Who believes that techno-feudalism is different to capitalism? Quick show of hands. You've got them convinced. I mean, that's pretty good. Thank you so much, Yanis, for joining us today.